Welcome to Tennessee, and in particular, the birthplace of Davy Crockett, also known as David Crockett. So this is a replica of the cabin he grew up in. But before we tell you about Davy Crockett, I first want to tell you a little bit about his parents and grandparents. His dad was John Crockett, and his grandparents, they lived in Virginia. And in 1776, his dad went off and fought in the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence. Now, what's interesting, though, and sad, is that in 1777, while his dad was away fighting in the war, his grandparents and his family were in a skirmish with the Chickamauga Cherokee Indians. And that's when Davy Crockett's grandparents, his dad John's parents, were killed in that skirmish. One of his brothers was wounded, and another brother was taken captive for 17 years. So that was the first real family skirmish or run-in with Native Americans as the European settlers kept moving west and settling on more lands that the Indians used for hunting and where they lived. So we're going to find out next about his boyhood. So hang on, we'll be right back. It's a beautiful river. This is the river that Davy Crockett grew up on. And his dad built a grist mill. Now, a grist mill is a big water wheel that's turned by the water. And then that in turn has some gears, and it turns a mill which grinds the grain and the corn into a flour, into a milled powder that can be used in cooking and such. And so his father built that and borrowed some money to build it, but then a big flood came through here and it washed away his grist mill, and it put him far into debt that would ultimately affect Davy. Now, when he was 12, in order to pay some bills, 12 years old, mind you, his father basically sold him as an indentured servant. Now, that's not a slave, but an indentured servant is someone who has to work for another person until a certain amount of money is paid off. Then they get their freedom back. So Davy was sold to another man as an indentured servant to go on a cattle drive. And so he went on a cattle drive to Virginia, and he came back. When he came back, his dad said, "It's time for you to start going to school." Now think about that. He's 12 years old. It's time for him to start going to school. But that led to the biggest adventure of his life. We're going to learn about that in just a minute. So now we're at the Crockett Homestead. This is the actual area that, as a youth, that he grew up. You can see how the home was built. They had these trees that they would cut down, and they would put mud in between the trees to basically serve as the mortar. Over here you can see the pen for the animals. And then, of course, just beyond this pen, that's the river. That's where they built their grist mill. And so the challenge was, once Davy's dad went into debt, the problem was that now he had to pay it off. So Davy went and worked off part of it. He came back. He was supposed to go to school, but there was a bully at school, a bigger kid who was bullying him. So he waited until after school, and then they fought, and Davy won. But after that, he wasn't going back to school. He knew that trouble awaited him, so he was playing hooky. Well, his dad found out he was playing hooky, and just as they did back in those days, he planned to give him a whipping, or what we might call today a spanking. Well, Davy was having none of that. When he saw his dad was going to give him a whipping, he took out on foot and ran as fast as he could. And his dad, he couldn't keep up. And Davy didn't stop running. He just kept on running. And pretty soon he found a job again as a cattle hand on a cattle drive. Then he did another one. Then he worked for a farmer. And for 4 years, he was away from home. He finally went back to home, and he reconciled with his father, which means the two of them made up. And his dad still had some debts, and he said, Davy, if you work off these debts for me, go work for these men and get rid of these debts, then you'll have my blessing to go out in your life and make a difference in this world. And that's exactly what Davy did. He worked off his father's debts, and then he left home and began to make a difference. And we're going to learn about what a big difference he made as we head west in Tennessee. Right now we're in eastern Tennessee. We're heading to West Tennessee, then to Alabama, then to Washington, D.C., and then who knows where. This is the story of Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. So, we're at Crockett Falls in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, and this is David Crockett State Park. You can see it's a beautiful area. But what I want to talk about today is the relationship that Davy Crockett had, especially with the Creek Indians, because this is going to be an important part of his story his entire life, from beginning to pretty much the end of his life. So this is Tennessee, but the Creek Indians primarily lived south of here, in Alabama and in Georgia. Now, the Creek divided into two groups. There were the Redsticks, which they were known for that because of the red on their war mallets. And then there was the other group, those that had intermarried with the European settlers and had traded with them and exchanged property and that type of thing. So you had two groups. The Redsticks had declared war on the European settlers because the European settlers had moved into their area, taken their land, and were changing their ways. So what's interesting is that Davy Crockett's grandparents ended up being killed in a skirmish with Indians. And then later, his second wife, Elizabeth, her two children died at the Battle of Fort Mims. And the battle at Fort Mims becomes very important in defining Davy Crockett's life. So we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. So today we are at Tallassee Creek outside of Alexandria, Alabama. And we're here because the story of Davy Crockett in his 20s, in his youth, comes to this location. And that's because General Andrew Jackson had called up for an army for the Creek Indian War. And Tennessee sent almost 1,000 volunteers to fight in this Creek Indian battle. And so what you need to know is the Battle of Tallushatchee was a big victory for the Americans and a big loss for the Redstick Creek Indians. And what happened was in August of 1813, there was a battle at Fort Mims. And this Battle of Fort Mims occurred because there was a skirmish earlier in July between the Redstick Creek Indians and the soldiers at Fort Mims. And there was an ambush. The Redstick Indians were surprised, but they ended up winning that skirmish. They planned an attack then on Fort Mims. So in Fort Mims, there were European settlers, American European settlers. There were some soldiers, and there were slaves. And there were Tensaw Indians. These were the Creek Indians who had decided to become a part of the American European society. And so the Creek Indians amassed about 1,000 warriors. And led by their chief, they attacked the Fort Mims. They killed 180 soldiers. And then in their zeal, they continued killing and killed almost all of the men, women, and children, the settlers of that area that were in there. And especially they killed the Tensaw Indians and took many scalps. This, of course, created a great deal of anger. And in fact, for Davy Crockett, what happened was that his second wife, 2 of her children died in the Battle of Fort Mims. And so here on Tallushatchee Creek, there was a village of Redstick Indians and their warriors. And so the battle moves from Fort Mims to here with the army that General Jackson had called up of Tennessee volunteers. We're going to walk up to where the village was because villages were built next to water. So we're going to walk up where the village was next.